Okay, so just to repeat very briefly, I have a long-standing deep connection to the Baeck Institute because my very first fellowship coming out of East Germany after the wall came down was here at the LBI. In the beginning of the 1990s, I spent 3 months at the LBI doing research for my dissertation on Jewish forced labor organized by civil authorities. So today I want to give you an insight into the book, and I do this in the following way. First, I will give you a little bit of a story, which is one of 5 main chapters in the book, which is one of the main 5 stories. Then I will explain a little bit why, in my view, we didn't really recognize the kinds of resistance act which I kind of show in the book. And then I will share with you an overview of the really incredible variety of resistance acts. So let me start with the story of Hans Oppenheimer. Hans Oppenheimer was a 17-year-old Jewish boy. He lived in Frankfurt. And every night, and this is during the war, at the end of 1940, when the Allied kind of forces had already started bombing campaigns throughout Germany, every night he left his house. The city was pitch black dark because of the brownout. He kind of ignored the curfew for Jews, which was established at the beginning of the war. Okay. And what he did was, he waited for the Allied bombers to kind of close to Frankfurt. When they dropped their the bombs and he heard the first explosions, he rushed to the next fire alarm post and set off a wrong fire alarm to divert the firefighters from the actual bombing sites. He did this for weeks. And now we have the question, how did he come to this decision to kind of go out and do this kind of resistance act? So he was the son of a merchant family in Frankfurt. The family was well off before 1933. The father sold linen to kind of tailors in Frankfurt. They lived in a big apartment on an imposing boulevard in Frankfurt. He went to a public school, but in 1933, when the Nazis took power, his parents enrolled him in a private school, which was very famous in Frankfurt, the Philanthropin, founded by the Rothschild family in the 1900s, because this kind of middle school could protect their pupils a little bit from the increasing hostile environment in Frankfurt. And Frankfurt was especially hostile to Jews because the new mayor kind of established very quickly measures against Jews, like he dismissed Jewish employees from the municipality, he cut off business ties to Jewish enterprises, and later on the city was one of the forerunners among German cities, for example, establishing low rates for Jewish needy and public welfare. They were the first ones Aryanizing Jewish art collections and Jewish private foundation. So Frankfurt especially was hostile. And when Hans left middle school with good grades, he decided not to go to high school. He decided to learn a craft for 2 reasons. One was he wanted to get a job very fast to sustain his family, because his father had lost his business. They were now depending on public welfare, and as I just said, they only got really reduced rates as kind of a Jewish needy. The second reason was that he wanted to he realized, because of the increasingly hostile atmosphere against Jews and the policies, he saw no future in Germany. So he thought learning a craft like a blacksmith or a gardener would help him to emigrate and find a future somewhere else. So he went to a private, newly founded Jewish school where Jewish teenagers learned like crafts like gardeners, as I mentioned, and blacksmiths. And in spring 1939, So a few months after Kristallnacht, he finished again with good grades this apprenticeship and went to the labor office to find his first job. The labor office in Frankfurt sent him immediately to a Jewish forced labor camp. And this, you might not know, this is the result of a very early anti-Jewish forced labor program which first targeted Jews who were unemployed and received unemployment benefits. And in the summer of 1939, so before the war even had started, 20,000 Jewish men were toiling as forced laborers in road construction, dam constructions, street cleanings, garbage removals, often working also for municipalities. And he had to work for a small city, kind of miles away from Frankfurt. And in this forced labor camp, this was, by the way, he was first sent to one, then to another, and the second one was the conditions, the labor conditions and living conditions for these Jewish men and Jewish teenagers. He was still kind of 16 years old when he started with forced labor, were terrible. The mayor was extremely anti-Semitic. He separated the Jewish forced labor from the town people. They were only allowed to spend their spare time in a very kind of restricted area in the town. And he ordered beatings, and this is before the war, yeah, to enhance productivity of the laborers. One of the forced laborers committed suicide in this camp. So when Hans Oppenheimer came back from Kelkheim, that was the name of the town on the labor camp, this was the moment that this personal experience in general, the situation in Frankfurt, and then his personal experience in the labor camp, which motivated him to do something. So he went out, broke the curfew every night, set off wrong fire alarms. Unfortunately, because of the curfew, he didn't dare to go too far from his home. And this is how then the Gestapo caught him red-handed when he was waiting in front of a fire alarm post not far from his home. And he was arrested. He was put in pre-trial detention, and there he waited 4 months for a trial. The prosecutor in Frankfurt wanted to charge him with treason. So there was discussion in Frankfurt that what he did kind of amounted to treason. There was a conversation with the Reich Ministry of Justice, but they could not really establish a legal ground for treason. So in the end, they charged him with several felonies, and including that he acted as a vermin sabotaging the German war effort. Yeah, there was a new kind of law against vermin who sabotaged the war effort. The prosecutor asked for 6 years in penitentiary. This was quite a harsh sentence. The trial went very quick. In the end, Hans, who had no defense lawyer present, he was now kind of turning 18 during the trial. There he received in the end a sentence of 3 years in a regular jail. This was much less than the prosecutor has asked for, but it was still 3 years for a young man who had just set off some wrong fire alarms. And the judge, in the end, in his verdict, commented on that he would not kind of prosecute him for adult law, under adult law, because he was a teenager when he did this. However, he should have behaved differently because he was, as a Jew, only a guest in Germany. So, after the verdict, he was transferred to a small jail far from Frankfurt. And there immediately he was put by the prison warden into solitary confinement. For months, he now spent his time, he had no contact to other inmates. And remember, he's 18 years old. Yeah? And he started to suffer physically also and mentally. He had to do some kind of prison labor, as all inmates had to do, but there was no health care, so he started to develop kind of illnesses. There was no kind of doctor coming. He petitioned several times the warden and the guards, and he was then kind of pictured as the rebellious Jew who would always kind of complain about the circumstances. The only lifeline he had were the letters he could send monthly to his family. The parents were still in Frankfurt. However, many of these letters never ended up with the parents, and also vice versa. Some letters of the parents never reached Hans, because the censorship in prison was pretty harsh, and many of the letters of Hans were censored because he was very outspoken about the horrible conditions in prison. And in one of the letters, the parents kind of urged him he should not be so rebellious because he would suffer these consequences. And he told them, and this is a quote, "If I think about my life, I can go crazy. You know best that I never had the chance to go to a cinema, to a cabaret or a theater." So he was mentally and physically breaking down. He committed twice suicide attempt, or attempted to commit suicide twice, was saved by the guards, and in the end, after 2 years in prison, there was an agreement between the Reich Ministry of Justice and the head of the SS to remove all Jewish prisoners from regular prisons to concentration camps, which at the time, at the end of 1942, this is the time when the mass deportations were in full swing, meant they were not moved to Dachau or Sachsenhausen, they were all moved to Auschwitz. So Hans, who was now kind of at the end of his 19th year, was transferred to Auschwitz, and because he was so weakened, kind of mentally and physically, he only survived 3 weeks in Auschwitz, and he perished on January 30th, 1943. This was only a few days after he had turned 20 years old. So, what does the story of Hans Oppenheimer tells us differently about individual responses of Jews during the Nazi persecution? During the Third Reich, Nazis complained quite a lot about Jews in their official reports, like Gestapo reports, SS reports, and they used a term, the impudent Jew. And so, for example, in March 1935, the Gestapo in Aachen reported, and I quote, "The number of Jews who had sent letters or protested in person has become quite numerous and in their tone often impudent," end of quote. And this goes on for the whole time of the Third Reich and still is valid during the war. So even after years of oppression. But we thought always, and I include myself here as an historian, we thought the mentioning of the impudent Jew was just a pretext to introduce new, harsher, more radical measures against the Jews. But there was a grain of truth to it. In July 1935, the Gestapo in Berlin reported about the Jews that they were born with disrespect for state authority. That's a quote. During the same months, more than 100 Jews in Berlin were arrested for offenses against the Nazi state and the Nazi party. So you see, what they say in the report, there is some truth to it. So, and when we take these kind of facts, and we have still, like Hans Oppenheimer, more than 1,200 Jews were in prison at the end of 1942. From the remaining Jewish population at the time, this would mean, if you would take the kind of population of the United States, this would mean 6 million people would be in prison for resistance. 6 million, yeah, if you have the correlation to the US population and the number, kind of, or percentage of prisoners. So this was a remarkable percentage of Jews arrested and imprisoned. for their protest and other acts of resistance. So what I think my research shows that Jews in general, but particularly Jews in Nazi Germany, did resist the terrors of the Third Reich. They were not passive. And I think the problem for us was that the idea of passivity stemmed from two kind of reasons. The first reason is a narrow conceptual approach. What is Jewish resistance? Right after 1945, there was discussion about Jewish resistance, but it was confined to armed rebellions, insurrections in kind of extermination sites, partisans, the parachuters, but not about individual acts of resistance. There were Israeli scholars from the very beginning who said we need to have a broader approach here, but they kind of in a way didn't found really resonance among scholars. So most scholars talking about resistance resort to organized group resistance and armed resistance. And since these kind of occurrences were rather rare, there kind of the idea came that Jews didn't really resist, or not many Jews resisted. However, there were already kind of ideas to broaden this up. And not only in Israel, but also in general discussions about resistance, for example, about Germans who non-Jewish Germans who resisted, where the German discussion included non-conformism, for example, as an act of resistance. And we have similar ideas also among scholars of, for example, US slavery or Jim Crow, that they look at individual acts of resistance differently. So what I tried to do is I revived some old notions and some known notions now it's kind of, yeah. So what I did is I took an existing definition by a prominent Israeli scholar, Yehuda Bauer, and just added this one word, individual. And I think, for me, this changed everything. And I want to illustrate a little bit how we can actually see this already, just looking at pictures and photographs. So this is a picture which usually is used to illustrate the terror of the first weeks in Nazi Germany. This is in Munich. A Jewish lawyer is dragged by the stormtroopers through the city. But if you look closer here, he has a sign, a kind of a poster hanging around his neck, which says, "I won't complain at the police station anymore." What he did is he tried to kind of liberate a client of his who had been arrested by the stormtroopers. Or look at this picture. I use this usually in my classes when I think about, or when I talk about the initiative role of municipalities and city governments, because of they enacted kind of restrictions like access to public swimming pools. However, after rethinking resistance, look at her body language. Why would she even dare to take a picture of the humiliation not being able to access the swimming pool? Or this Jewish family from a small town let their son taking a picture in front of their house where one of the most notorious anti-Jewish slogans was just painted 2 days before the picture. Why would they let their son take a picture standing in front of this anti-Jewish slogan? Or the cover of the book, my favorite photo. This is Lizzie Rosenfeld. She lived in Vienna. This is summer of 1939, before the war. And I don't know who reads German here.
Only for Aryans.
Only for Aryans, so not for Jews. So she, as a Jewish woman, sits on a bench, which is prohibited, and look also at her body language, how she is embracing and showing, you can't do this with me. She commits 3 offenses. she sits on a forbidden bench, she lets her friend take a picture, and then she smuggles the negative out when she is able to emigrate. And today it's at the Holocaust Museum in DC. However, even taking pictures could be an act of resistance. Like the next picture should show. This is a picture which Hans Sachs took, who was the owner of this apartment. He documented the violent home invasion during Kristallnacht. So he documented with his photograph an act of violence committed by the Nazis against his family. So to document crimes was an act of resistance, obviously, and I found in police diaries mentioning of Jews taking pictures as act to document crimes against Jews. So what I do in my work here is not only to broadening up the definition of resistance, but also I use a different set of sources than we used to use for to discuss Jewish attitudes and behavior. Most historians have used either Nazi reports, like the Gestapo reports, and they didn't really want to talk about Jewish resistance because they had the idea of the weak Jew, or they would use diaries and letters written by Jews, but they were under censorship. So not many Jews dared actually to write in their diaries about what they did or in their letters. There are a few exceptions, but most people feared censorship. So what I do in my book is I use a broad source base, which is on the one hand police records from different cities, court records from special courts and regular courts, and then I added 170 testimonies of the USC Shoah Foundation of German Jewish survivors. I visited archives in Berlin first because I thought maybe there's more resistance because it's a big city, but then I found that also in Frankfurt, Leipzig, Dresden, Munich, Hamburg, and Vienna, in all of these cities is an equal amount of a variety of resistance acts by individual Jews. So what I try now to do is, or what I had as a problem writing the book was, I found hundreds and hundreds of cases. How to organize this? So I came up with the idea to kind of create these 5 categories here. And in the rest of the time, I will share some stories which are falling under these different rubrics here. So, contesting Nazi propaganda, oral protest, written protest, disobedience regarding anti-Jewish kind of measures, and then the most surprising is physical self-defense. So let me start with the first one, contesting Nazi propaganda. Interestingly, I never thought about this before I started this research, but Jews ripped down Nazi flags. They besmeared displays of anti-Jewish newspapers. They tore down anti-Jewish propaganda posters. Or they did something like David Bornstein. He was from Hamburg, he was a merchant, and one summer day, was warm like today, here in New York, he accompanied his wife to a bus terminal because his wife wanted to visit her parents, his parents-in-law. With her, he was waiting for the departure of the bus. While waiting, he tried to destroy the swastika logo on the public bus. And I hope you can see this. Can you see these scratches? So with his walking stick, he tried to kind of destroy this kind of logo. And he did this in a way you can see here. This is not David Bornstein. This is one of the first attempts of historical reenactment. Yeah, this is the Gestapo officer kind of impersonating David Bornstein. And you see here how he tries to scratch the swastika, and up there in the window, this is supposedly his wife, but the impersonator is actually the bus conductor who denunciated David Bornstein. So David Bornstein was arrested. After the denunciation, he was put on trial, and he received 6 weeks in jail for kind of destroying kind of an official symbol of the Nazi state. 6 weeks. And prison time was not an easy thing, it's never an easy thing, but especially for Jews in Nazi Germany. He got out of prison, and then something happened which I also was not really aware of. In 1938, oh, sorry, I forgot to mention when this was. So this happened in 1936. 2 years later, in 1938, there was a big kind of action against so-called asocials, yeah, in Germany. And under the kind of umbrella of this big raid nationwide, 2,500 Jews were also arrested who had criminal records. And we usually used to say these were Jews with minimal kind of felonies. They were caught driving kind of drunk, or these were kind of small things. But now I realized he was also arrested, David Bornstein. So people who performed resistance acts, either material acts like him, or protested in public against the persecution, also kind of fell victim of this raid and ended up in concentration camp. He fortunately survived, was released after a few months, and immediately left after this experience of the concentration camp at the end, before Kristallnacht actually, with his wife and his daughter for Palestine. And there his kind of trace is disappearing. And Karen here from the Leo Baeck Institute was really helping me, trying to pin down where would he go, where ended he up being, but we were kind of unsuccessful. There were hints of South Africa, there were hints of kind of that he stayed in Palestine and Israel, then there were hints he ended up in Canada. We don't know, unfortunately. We only know that he survived and got out of Germany, which is not the worst outcome. Right? Okay, next is oral protest. So oral protest was very widespread. It starts immediately, as we can assume, in 1933. For example, in Frankfurt, there were several trials against Jews who criticized in public the first wave of terror, where also Jews were affected. They were beaten up in the street by stormtroopers. So Jews were publicly kind of criticizing these acts or protesting against them, and were immediately arrested. And then protest against individual acts like the Nuremberg laws or other laws or violent events were very common in all the kind of cities and locations I looked at. And let me... So, for example, there is the story of Henriette Schäfer. This is one of the main stories in the book. She experienced Kristallnacht in Frankfurt, and the next morning, and this is why I'm looking at the paper because I need the quote, and the next morning she went into a store and asked the shop owner what he would think about kind of the event of the last night, the arsoning of synagogues and the destruction of shops. And the store owner said, yeah, so this was happening because the German people are outraged about the assassination of the German diplomat in Paris by a Jew. So this was along the party lines, the Nazi party kind of propaganda lines. Then she said, quote, "This is not the people, but the government. They are all blackguards, scums, and criminals. Hitler is the biggest bandit. If I could, I would poison them all." End of quote. So she received 6 months in prison for this public comment. And she received this under this law. The law against treacherous attacks on the state and the Nazi Party, which was enacted in 1934. And we always thought this was a law targeting communists and social democrats. But I found in my research that dozens and dozens of Jews were actually kind of indicted and then under this law and also sentenced under this law. And just to give you, because I don't have a picture of Henriette Schäfer, I want to share at least one picture with you of one of these courageous women who protested in public. And this is Gabriele Reich. She was living in Vienna, and very late in February 1942, so during the war, the mass deportation had already started. She was sentenced to 10 months in prison because she had in public insulted Hitler, she had protested against anti-Jewish measures, and she had listened to foreign broadcasts. So about her faith, I don't know any more than she was kind of imprisoned. So the next category is written protest. So written protest has two kind of a range. One is a very kind of the only legal method how Jews actually could criticize the situation in Germany. This was via petition. And treatments were kind of by German law, even in the Nazi state, possible. Jews did kind of send tons of petitions. They wanted to be excluded from certain anti-Jewish measures. But what most historians overlooked, in almost every petition, they also reclaimed their own status as Germans, as contributors to the homeland, as contributors to the culture, as taxpayers. So it is not just to kind of be exempt from certain measures, it is also to kind of show that they have a status, legal status in Germany as citizens. The other end are anonymous leaflets. And for example, I mentioned earlier, 1935, in summer in Berlin, there were riots against Jews. And so Jewish shop owners who were attacked, they would send petitions to the police president in Berlin. But then, at the same time, there were also anonymous leaflets found in mailboxes in the city center. This is not the leaflet, this is the police report about it. But the leaflet said, and I quote, "Germany is a cultural disgrace today. I'm a German Jew and loyal to the emperor. In fact, the Germans should expel the foreigner Hitler. Down with Hitler, exclamation mark." End of quote. The Gestapo never got a hold of the author of this leaflet, that's what I know. But you have this kind of combination of petitions and anonymous leaflets throughout the whole period of the existence of Jews in Nazi Germany. And I want to share the main story, which is in the book. This is the story of a 70-year-old man. He was a former real estate broker in Munich. His name was Benno Neuburger, and he had lost his business, but not because of the Nazis. This was during inflation. But he had lost his children because they emigrated immediately, very quick after the Nazis took power. So he and his wife, they never experienced the marriages of their kids. They never experienced the birth of their grandchildren. They barely saw a photograph in a letter of their grandchildren. So they tried to get out to kind of unite with their children in the US, but they could not make it out. And so they got stuck in Munich, and they tried first US, then Cuba, but nothing really worked. So in the end, I think the last straw which broke the camel's neck was the introduction of the Yellow Star. Because a week after the Yellow Star was introduced, Benno Neuburger took post stamps like this, Hitler post stamps, put them on postcards, and wrote abusive comments on them. And this looked like this. Here it is. So here you see it. He wrote over the post stand and then he made comments. And the comments are extreme. So it says, for example, Hitler, perish, Bestien, murderer, bandit, the eternal murderer, Hitler, disgusting, exclamation mark. And this one is very prophetic. Here he says, the murderer of 5 million. And this is not even at the end of 1941, when the mass extermination didn't really have fully started. It had started in the occupied Soviet Union, but Auschwitz was not working yet. So this is very prophetic. And he made one mistake. He used one of the postcards was from his old real estate firm. And that's how the Gestapo got a hold of him. They arrested him, and this case was perceived as treason. And he was transferred from Munich to Berlin to the notorious People's Court, which was highly anti-Semitic, highly Nazi court. This was a show trial. And even during the show trial, when he was asked by the prosecutor, why would he do these kind of things? He said, he stood by what he already had said to the Gestapo in Munich, and to share his picture, the Gestapo interrogated him and they tortured him. You can see here the bruises there and here. He had still, when the Gestapo tortured him, he said, I did this because I hate Hitler, because he wanted to annihilate the Jews, he wanted to murder the Jews, and he had even publicly announced it. And this was true because Hitler gave a speech in January 1939 where he said, when there will be a world war, then this will be the end of the European Jewry. So he would even say this in front of the show trial in Berlin. And the outcome was preordained in a way it was prescribed. He received the death penalty, and on September 18, 1942, he was decapitated or beheaded by the guillotine in the Berlin prison. Like many other resistors too. So the almost last is the one disobedience of Nazi laws and local restrictions. And I think this is, I don't need to talk so much about this here because Hans Oppenheimer his story falls under this rubric. But I think interesting is that you have kind of a huge variety what disobedience of Nazi restrictions means. So, for example, Max Mannheimer, he was a forced laborer during the war in Bohemia. He kind of visited a public park and broke the curfew also several times and ripped down kind of anti-Jewish signs. And Hans Oppenheimer set off wrong fire alarms. Others went to forbidden pubs or forbidden cinemas. One thing I didn't really had on my mind when I did this research, but what I found in the archives was, you all know that German Jews had to adopt the discriminatory middle names Sarah and Israel, right, to identify them. What I didn't realize is that German is a legal state. When you want to change your name, you need to fill out an application form. So even under the Nazis, it was not enough that the Nazis said the Jews have to adopt these names. Every Jew had to apply for it and paid 3 Reichsmark. And many, many German Jews didn't do it. And even more interesting, mostly elderly Jews. And I think it makes sense because their whole life was connected to their names. Younger Jews had not such an issue with kind of adopting these names, but elderly Jews, yes. And and some of them, they actually navigated for 2 or 3 years through kind of their life without adopting these middle names, also without carrying kind of ID cards with their name, with Jew on it, or the J on it. So for example, Ida Schneider, she was 73 years old in Leipzig. She was only detected in 1942 by the Gestapo that she never adopted the name and had no kind of Jewish identification at all. Yeah. So that's kind of also an overlooked aspect of how Jews resisted against measures. And the last one before I end is physical self-defense. And this was the most surprising. And an interesting fact is, in the German archives, I almost found no records at all of how that Jews physically kind of got into brawls with stormtroopers or anything. And I think the reason is kind of physical altercations were just not recorded by the police or the Gestapo if there was no political context to it. So when a Jew would attack a stormtrooper and call them, "You bloody Nazi," then it would be recorded because of the political context. But in most cases, this seemed not to have been happened. There was just physical altercations. So from the testimonies of the Shaw Foundation, I learned that Jewish men got into brawls with stormtroopers on the street, in restaurants. They beat up one in Berlin, a young man beat up 2 stormtroopers who had to arrest the landlady who was Jewish in their apartment building. And he came from work, met these 2 stormtroopers, and he had kind of iron tools with him. And with the iron tools, he was managing to kind of defeat the 2 stormtroopers. During Kristallnacht, during the attack against Jewish synagogues, shops, and apartments, also some Jews resisted. So for example, in Peine, in Lower Saxony, there was a 17-year-old son of a family. He tried to defend his father, who was beaten up by SS people who invaded his home. But they overwhelmed the 17-year-old boy and killed him. But to not end on another kind of drastic note, I want to share this story with you. This is the story, also a chapter in the book. This is the story of a 16-year-old girl. This is a photo where she is like 18 or 19. She came from Berlin, and when she was 16, she moved to one of the Hachshara camps, the retraining camps in preparation for immigration, to learn agricultural skills. So she was in this camp with a lot of female and male teenagers, and when Kristallnacht happened, most of these retraining camps were actually also invaded by stormtroopers. And often the students were beat up, the teachers were beaten up, and were brought to concentration camps, and the facilities were destroyed. The same happened where she was, in Urfeld. But first, they made the male teenagers walk through, is it a gallows, where they kind of 2 rows of stormtroopers, and then one has to go through the rows, and then they beat from both sides. Yeah? And this is the situation which she now starts to talk about.
The kids, you know, the youngsters, and the boys, they were bleeding. And then all of a sudden I came my turn. I said, hell, I'm not going to run. I'm going to walk. Here I am. I mean, 5 foot nothing. I'm 5'1". 5 nothing, and I'm a skinny little girl. And I was...
Sorry, oh, what did I do?
slideshow.
The kids,
Oh,
you know, the youngsters. And the boys, they were bleeding. And then all of a sudden I came my turn. I said, hell, I'm not going to run. I'm going to walk. Here I am. I mean, 5'0", I'm 5'1", 5'0", and I'm a skinny little girl. And all of a sudden, they wasn't any fun anymore. And I remember getting one on the back, and that was it. I just walked through very slowly, looking at all of them. Now here, big tough guys. You want to hit a little girl? What can I do about it? You know, it's the attitude. And I only got hit by one on the back that hurt. And I got to the end of the line, one of them grabs me, grabs this hand, my right hand, and starts sawing into it with a rusty knife. Pocket knife type thing. Well, I'd learned a little trick, and that's sticking my head into someone's stomach, which doesn't feel great. And I turned around to see what I could do with him, and I started fighting, and I started kicking with my legs, his legs. He wasn't very big either, and he was young. Anyway, I finally managed to get my head out and under the knife. I twisted the knife out of his hand, I used the knife, I stabbed him, and I dug my head into his thigh. I don't know how I did it. It was just a fast thing that they had taught me. And the others didn't notice it. So a couple of the guys, the others were too busy beating up on their film. So a couple of the guys saw it and they dragged him underneath a bed or some kind of a sofa type thing that hadn't been kicked over so the others wouldn't see him. He was bleeding. He wasn't dead, and he was bleeding. Anyway, that's when we took off. We ran, all of us. And they started coming after, then give up on it.
So to explain this somehow miraculous event, she was trained in jiu-jitsu self-defense in Hashomer HaTzair back in Berlin when she was kind of 12 to 14. And that's what she applied here. And she was rebellious from the very beginning, already in Berlin. So she managed to escape. The stormtroopers actually caught up with the group. They were arrested or kind of brought back to the camp, and they managed to escape again. And in the end, she ended up running to ending up in Cologne at the Jewish community, and from there she got kind of transferred to England. So that's how she got out of Germany. Okay, to conclude and to summarize this a little bit. So when we define resistance as individual or group action against any Nazi laws or programs or intentions, I think you, and I hope you now also agree that this changes our perspective drastically, what resistance can be. I think my research brought to light an enormous amount of courageous acts, but this is just the tip of the iceberg because I'm a one-man show. Yeah? Although it took me 12 years to do the research, there are tons of archives in Germany which I didn't touch. And then think about that, as we know from the Shoah Foundation, some of the acts were never denunciated. So there is also a large number of acts which happened which we don't have reports about. So there is so much still to explore in this regard. I think the categorization with these 5 different types helped to kind of understand the variety of acts. And I think one of the most important lessons from the research is actually, and you might have guessed this from the presentation, that there is no real pattern who can resist. There is no age pattern. Young and elderly resisted. There is no gender pattern. Women equally as men resisted. There is no, let's say, class pattern. kind of wealthy Jews as also blue-collar workers were resisting. So I found this the most interesting and important actually result of this research, that everybody coming into a certain situation is able to resist. And many Jews just did this, indeed. And the variety of acts is in a way also the response of the variety of the different persecution measures. And Rabbi Nussbaum from Berlin said this pretty nicely in a quote in the 1960s. He said, "We were besieged in 100 of different manners, and therefore we fought back in 100 of different manners." Some may think maybe these small acts are not really, is this really resistance? But I think in the end, for me, it only matters what the Nazis perceived as resistance. And you saw how harshly they reacted towards very small acts of defiance. And I think we need to appreciate and commemorate these courageous acts of so many individual Jews. We need to incorporate them in our standard Holocaust narrative. And with that, we can, I think, understand the Jewish man and woman as historical actors, not as a passive, amorphous mass of people persecuted, but as really people with agency. And I think this kind of obliterates the old idea of Jewish passivity once and for all. Thank you.
So if anyone from the audience has a question, I think we have time for a few, and we'll also take some questions from online, but I see a hand up here.
Thank you. We know that German Jews, for the most part, were very assimilated. Were they aided and abetted by non-Jewish spouses or Christian friends in their resistance against the Nazi regime?
Yeah, that's a good question. I try to focus only on Jews. That means, while there is one, the story of Henriette Schäfer is from a mixed marriage, but that's the exception. Almost all my other cases are from Jewish families, and I could not see this as a pattern, that there were kind of non-Jewish friends. I think this is a question for the future, because nobody exists in a vacuum. Right, and I focused on individuals, but in my storytelling, there is also the mentioning of they have families, they have friends, and this obviously influences what people think, what they do, and it can be confirming, it can be also hindering. But just to share one aspect, Benno Neuburger, who wrote these postcards, he never told his wife about these. His wife didn't know until he was actually murdered what he actually did. Yeah.
So I think we could take a question from online. There's anonymous attendee who asks, clearly the judicial system had to support the Nazi laws. Were there any judges who refused?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. This was also, in a way, something surprising, because previously I thought, as many other historians, there is this steady Nazification of the judicial system. So more and more Nazi prosecutors come in, more and more Nazi judges. However, in my research, I found that, first of all, what happened is they cling to the legal system. Because often you can hear when Jews did something, they would just have thrown them into concentration camp. This never happened, really, at least not in Germany. In Germany, when there was a law applying, they were put on trial. Sometimes afterwards, the Gestapo asked, when they were released from prison, that they would take them into concentration camps. But first, they would go under the regular legal procedures. Second, while there was a Nazification, and often prosecutors were anti-Semitic, as I showed with Hans Oppenheimer, and even the judge kind of made this mentioning that Jews have to behave differently. What I found is that they had leeway to operate under the kind of, within the realms of the law. So they could be more lenient. So I found that Jews were acquitted, who protested similarly to those who went to prison, even in 1941 during the war, which only speaks to the judges operated under how they saw the law, and when there was a witness not reliable, they would throw out the case. So it was not like the show trials in Berlin. The regular courts, they had certain room to maneuver. And then it depended on the individual judges. And it is not that what I thought, there are more anti-Semitic judges and then there maybe more conservative, old-style judges. No, they depended often on situation. There was one judge in Hamburg who in 1941, in the beginning of the year, sentenced a Jewish man to several months in prison for publicly criticizing the persecution. Several months later, a Jewish woman went into a police station in Hamburg and yelled at the policeman, "Down with Hitler, I hate Hitler." And she got arrested, she was in a police station. She was put on trial. The same judge who had just put somebody other in jail gave her only 2 weeks. And in the verdict it says she acted out of despair. So, which is kind of a weird kind of justification. So he might have had sympathies with this woman, because several months later the same judge brought another woman who also criticized the persecution, again into prison for several months. So it depended on circumstances, situation, and many factors kind of guided practically the sentencing and also the indictments and so on. So there is much more kind of legal normality, one could say, than I ever expected.
How did the acts of resistance affect their families?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, it is really difficult, and this was actually what took up the most of the time of the research, was not to find all these cases, it was more to find out about the people. This was what took up so much time. So in many cases, what I can see, family members were not immediately kind of then targeted or also went to jail. This was very separate, yeah. But they were involved in different ways, because they went to prison to visit kind of their family members, or they wrote letters, or they kind of petitioned the authorities for early release, or even before they went to prison for kind of amnesty, or what is it called, so that they would not kind of punish the defendant. So families were in this case, in this scenario, always kind of part of these procedures. But not that I can see that somebody would actually be harmed because of what another family member did. At least not in Germany. I mean, this is very different in Poland and so on. I think we need to make differences here between Germany and the annexed territories, because already in Austria it's a little bit different. Sometimes there the Gestapo would override the legal system and would put some people straight to the concentration camp or put them on deportation trains.
And as I mentioned before, it would depend on the judge as well.
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I am so just a reflection on what you described. I mean, it seems like many of the cases that you spoke about, they were sort of like these individual acts of, I guess, destruction by the ordinary Jewish citizens. So, destroying damaging the property, or in case of the postcards, is basically like, anti-government graffiti in a way, right? Sometimes you see that in countries where you have situations like this. People just go out in the street and they do like anti-government graffiti, or just sort of writings on the walls. So that was like one, the way I see it, that was one level of resistance. You basically take the justice into your own hands. But since you brought up the legal system and discriminatory anti-Jewish laws in the country that were enacted by the Nazi Party, I'm wondering if there were any individual examples of resistance from within the system where certain attorneys, lawyers, not necessarily Jewish, but maybe Jewish as well, would actually stand up and say, well, this is wrong. Like, this is wrong to enact these laws against the Jewish population. I don't know if your research in this case touched upon these subjects, but maybe in your previous research you can, maybe speak about that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Two answers to this question. One is there were also Jews in Jewish communities, in Jewish organizations, who, for example, gave legal advice how to navigate anti-Jewish laws and how to kind of, in a way, disobey, but kind of under the radar. So there was, for example, in the Jewish community in Vienna, also Berlin and in Prague, Jews went there and tried to get kind of advice what they can do and what they can't do. And they got help with writing petitions, which was the only legal form to do, or sometimes they wrote the petitions for them, yeah, in the Jewish communities. So there was this kind of also help. There was, by the way, which I didn't mention, there were tons of petitions by Jewish communities and Jewish organizations against the persecution, to kind of requesting the abolishment of laws, local measures, and so on. So there's also, from the Jewish communities, way more activities than we ever thought. The other question, the other answer is, which I didn't research, but because I focused really on Jews there, I always came across actually non-Jews, and here it's interesting, they did the same as the Jews. So there were non-Jews protesting against the persecution of the Jews in a similar manner, like in the street, in the restaurant. They were criticizing these measures. They were equally denunciated, and they equally were put on trial, and they equally went to prison. And I didn't count, but I didn't see much difference actually in the sentencing there between the Jewish victims and the non-Jewish victims for the same thing. And I think this has to do something that the law prescribed a certain range of how many months you can get for something, and that's what they apply. So there was way more critique against the persecution of the Jews than we ever thought. Yeah, because there's always this idea also, on the one hand, Jewish passivity, and on the other hand, non-Jewish indifference, right? That's not really, I think, how this worked. There's, on the one hand, many more non-Jewish Germans were involved in the persecution in different ways, but also many more were actually showing solidarity, protested, and criticized the regime. So it's a much more complex kind of situation. And the interesting thing for me was, and this is true for non-Jewish critique and also Jewish critique, that there, in the beginning I thought we assume the critique is the strongest and the most in the beginning of the regime, like in 1933. And then it will go down because of oppression, that people see that there are repercussions, and so they don't dare anymore to do this. And there are even Jews after the war making exactly this argument that people got adapted, tried to adapt to the persecution. But what I see in the records is actually different. What I see is like this, waves, kind of spikes. And this is true even until the late kind of mass deportations. And it actually speaks to the fact that each act of individual resistance is a response to what the Nazis did, in general or specifically in the kind of locality or with the law. So Jews responded to either, for example, the Nuremberg race laws, there was a spike, to Kristallnacht because of the violence, the mass deportations. So it is really interesting that we have these kind of spikes of individual acts, at least what I can see in the records from my findings. But it is remarkable if we think that after 8 years of oppression, there can be a spike. Yeah? That was really fascinating for me, that with all the knowledge they had already, with all the persecution, that he still dared to kind of respond.
Thank you, very good presentation. I have some question about any statistic on the outcome, what's happened to them, if they survive, not survive, and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's also a good question. What I can say is, and this is a little bit the problem of the records. In many cases, I have only one record, like an entry in a police diary or a part of a police report. And I couldn't find other documentation about this. But what I can see in the trend is those who acted as resistors in the 1930s, they had actually a much bigger chance to survive, because after the experience of jail in Nazi Germany, most of them got out. Like David Bornstein. He didn't stay, right? But after the war started, this was not possible anymore. So most of those who did something after the war started just didn't have the chance to escape, and most of them perished. However, some of them also survived because some of the people who resisted were really what I call, they had resistance careers, like Daisy Grunovsky. I mean, she rebelled before she even came to the retraining camp as a teenager, and then she escaped twice after she was arrested. So there are more of those who kind of constantly, frequently rebelled, and they had a much bigger survival chance.
I have a question. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about the historiography of this, which you talked a little bit about at the very beginning, and especially the idea of spiritual resistance, and whether you draw a distinction between that concept and what you're talking about.
Yeah, so there is this, and this is what I can refer to, that Israeli scholars were from the very beginning insisting of a broader perspective, and they usually kind of refer to spiritual, cultural resistance, because there was, for example, the preservation of religion in the ghettos. There was this kind of hidden education in ghettos. However, I think here we have to distinguish between Germany and Poland, or occupied territories. In Germany, things were different in a way that the Nazis tried to separate Jews from non-Jews, which meant in Germany that they allowed Jews to perform culture, like putting up concerts, but they were not allowed to perform in regular orchestras anymore. So they separated this. So in Germany, it was not the preservation of culture was not kind of a daring need, as in the ghettos, for example. So there was a difference of situation. So I think where there are connections is that I think on top of what we knew about ghettos and spiritual resistance, that there were also smaller acts of resistance by individuals. And I think these kind of deserve our attention. And I think what I researched here on a larger scale is applicable to any occupied territory in Europe at the Nazi period, and even to other genocides. I mean,
I'm wondering one question. Being sentenced to jail is one thing, and it's terrible, but being sent to a concentration camp is far worse. So, can you comment on this?
yeah, I mean, obviously, sending to a concentration camp, there was, in a way, you were out of the legal system, right? So that's a very different situation. For me, interesting was that this idea that kind of lawlessness immediately took over Nazi Germany does not hold really, and that's why they end up all on trial, and judges kind of have to discuss their life and what they did and everything. Where you think it would have been much easier to just send them to a concentration camp. But in this way is in Germany proper, laws still were valid in a way, and people to a large degree try to follow the law. And for Jews who ended up then afterwards in concentration camp, then survival was really difficult. And I mean, this was extremely, as I tried to show with David Bornstein, after this experience, he didn't get out immediately after the jail, what other Jews did who were in jail. He didn't. But after the concentration camp experience, immediately he left.
Maybe one last question.
Your research seems primarily of individuals at the very beginning or before the war. And as you implied, you basically said that as the war got going, the chances of survival were much less. But I'm wondering, have you ever addressed, or maybe you have already, research into the years of the war when it became much worse? Do you have any research about individual examples of resistance at that point? I mean, we know there was tremendous resistance from the partisans and other groups, but do you have any information or research on individual
No, actually,
resistance?
my book is about the whole period.
It's the whole
It
period,
doesn't,
okay.
it doesn't stop with the war. Remember Benno Neuberger? This was 2 years into the war. Hans Oppenheimer was 1 year into the war. So the woman who went into the police station was 2 years in the war. The woman who was discovered in Leipzig that she didn't adopt, this was 3 years into the war. So many of my cases are actually from 1940, 1941, 1942, which I find remarkable. And this is what I meant with spikes, that even during the war, there are still spikes. So, yeah, no, many of my cases are from the war period.
Well, thank you, Wolf Gruner, so much for this presentation, and congratulations on the book. I think we can continue the conversation. We have some refreshments in back, so thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, Wolf.